I have always loved the early hours, when the world is quiet and the first rays of sunlight spill gently over the rooftops. At 68, mornings have become my sacred time, a chance to sit by the window with a cup of strong tea and listen to the birds. The house, though large, often feels unbearably empty now. My son Daniel rarely visits unless he needs something, and his young wife, Lydia, has never made any effort to hide her disdain for me. Still, I remind myself each morning that I am not bitter. I raised my boy alone after my husband passed, pouring every ounce of strength into ensuring he would have comfort and security. Every wall in this house, every acre of land surrounding it, every dollar in Daniel's pocket, all of it was built from my sacrifices. And yet, sometimes I wonder if he even remembers. That morning, the mail arrived with a thick, cream-colored envelope that stood out among the usual bills and advertisements. I opened it with trembling fingers, and inside was something that made my heart leap, an official letter declaring that I had won a month-long stay in a luxurious country mansion. 30 days of rest and peace, all expenses covered, a reward for a raffle ticket I had almost forgotten I had purchased at the local community fair. Tears welled in my eyes as I read the letter again and again. I could hardly believe such luck had found me at this age. After years of loneliness and silent labor, here was an unexpected gift, a chance to be cared for, pampered even, in a place where the air would be fresh and the days free of constant worry. I called Daniel immediately, my voice trembling with excitement. "Daniel," I said, "you won't believe this. I've won a month's stay in a country estate, a real mansion, everything included." For a brief moment, there was silence on the other end. Then he chuckled, the sound hollow and dismissive. "Really, Mom? A mansion trip? At your age? What will you even do there?" Before I could answer, Lydia's voice rang out in the background, sharp and mocking. "Why waste such a prize on her? She'll just sit around, boring everyone. That trip is wasted on someone who can barely walk up the stairs without huffing." Their laughter stung more than I wanted to admit. I held the phone tightly, trying not to let my voice shake. "It's something I've won, something meant for me," I whispered. But deep inside, a chill ran through me, because I already knew nothing I owned, nothing I received, had ever been safe from their greedy hands. As the evening drew in, the wind rattled the shutters, and the shadows stretched long across the floor. I sat alone in the quiet house, the letter still open on the table in front of me, the words blurring through my tears. I wanted so much to believe that this time, at least, happiness would not be stolen from me. But a darker thought gnawed at me, that my son and his wife would find a way to turn this gift, too, into another weapon against me. And deep in my chest, something stirred, not anger yet, but the seed of a strength I thought I had long lost. The next morning, the sun rose lazily, hiding behind a veil of gray clouds that threatened rain. The air was heavy, damp, and cool, and I sat at my old oak kitchen table with the letter in front of me, as though staring at it long enough might make everything real and safe. The edges of the paper were already softened from how many times I had unfolded and refolded it. But my excitement was tempered by dread. I knew my son Daniel too well. He was like the restless wind outside, never satisfied, always sweeping away what wasn't his to take. And Lydia, that girl barely out of her youth, knew how to whisper into his ear like poison dripping from a silver spoon. Together, they were dangerous. Together, they had turned me from the most important figure in his life into little more than an obstacle in their endless appetite for pleasure. Still, a small part of me wanted to share my joy. A mother's heart is stubborn. It clings to hope even after being beaten again and again. So that afternoon, when the sky broke into a drizzle and the garden smelled of wet earth, I drove to Daniel's house to show them the letter myself. Their new home, a sleek, modern place with more glass than wood, sitting on land I had helped them purchase, felt cold to me. Not just from the steel gray walls or the sharp lines of the architecture, but from the very atmosphere inside. It was Lydia who opened the door, her lips painted crimson, her nails long and glinting as if they could claw at anything she wanted. "Oh," she said, arching a brow, "it's you." Her voice carried no warmth. Still, I smiled and held out the letter. "I wanted to show you both in person. I want a trip, 30 days at a country mansion. Can you imagine? It feels like a dream." She snatched the paper from my hand without asking, her eyes darting over the words. Her lips curled into a smile, but not the kind that brought comfort. This smile was calculating, greedy. By the time Daniel joined us in the living room, Lydia was already chattering about how wonderful the mansion looked in the brochure she had quickly pulled up online. Pools, private chefs, horseback riding, gardens like something out of a movie, she exclaimed, her eyes shining with an excitement I had hoped, foolishly, to see reflected in my own son's face for me. Daniel glanced at me with that familiar patronizing smirk. "Mom, let's be honest. Do you really think you'd enjoy that? You'd be bored in a week. And the staff? They'd resent having to serve an old woman who probably won't even try the activities. It's a waste." I felt my throat tighten, as if someone had wrapped a cord around it. "It was given to me," I whispered. "It's mine. Just once, can't something be mine?" But Lydia's laughter cut through the room like glass shattering. "Oh, Julia, don't be selfish. Think about it. Daniel and I could go, and we'd make the most of it. We'd enjoy every corner, every luxury. It would be fair." Fair. That word echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. Was it fair when I sold my jewelry to help Daniel buy his first car? Was it fair when I worked 2 jobs to pay for his college, only for him to drop out and call it a waste of time? Was it fair when I opened my home to him and Lydia, cooking for them, cleaning up after them, until they had enough money to buy this cold glass palace? Fair. Always for them. Never for me. I tried to take the letter back, but Daniel's hand came down over it, firm and final. "We'll think about it," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a decision already made. That evening, I drove back to my house in the rain. The wipers beat against the windshield, keeping rhythm with my heart, which thudded painfully in my chest. By the time I reached the driveway, the storm had gathered strength, lashing against the windows as though nature itself was mourning with me. Inside, I sat by the fireplace, though I didn't light it. The house felt too empty, too cold. The shadows stretched along, and the silence pressed against my ears until it roared. I wanted to scream, I wanted to cry, but instead, I sat in stillness, my hands folded in my lap, trembling slightly. Because I knew. I knew they would take the trip. I knew they would leave me behind. I knew that just like everything else in my life, what was mine would be stripped away and paraded around as theirs. And yet, even as the bitterness burned at the back of my throat, a part of me hardened. I thought of my late husband, of all the times we had faced hardship together and fought back. I thought of the young woman I once was, fierce, determined, unwilling to bow. They believed I was old, weak, helpless. But they would soon learn that even at 68, a woman's heart can hold fire. That night, as the storm raged outside and the trees bent under the furious wind, something inside me shifted. My pain was real, my humiliation raw, but beneath it, something else began to rise, a quiet, simmering resolve. They might laugh at me now. They might steal my joy, mock my age, and think they have won. But storms pass, and when they do, the air is clearer. And I promised myself as the thunder rolled above the roof that I would not be their victim forever. The days after our conversation felt like walking on broken glass. I tried to convince myself that maybe Daniel and Lydia wouldn't really take it, that perhaps they had only been toying with me, exaggerating as they always did, And in the end, they'd see the trip for what it was, a gift for me, not for them. But the silence was telling. Neither of them called, neither came by. The letter was gone too, and I hadn't the strength to ask for it back. I knew the moment I left their house that night in the rain, it no longer belonged to me. Still, hope is stubborn. Each morning I woke with a small, foolish spark, thinking maybe they'll surprise me, maybe they'll invite me along. Maybe my son still remembers what it is to be my child. That spark lasted exactly 1 week. It was a chilly Saturday morning. I sat in my worn armchair, a quilt wrapped around my shoulders, the television humming softly in the background. My phone buzzed on the side table. I reached for it, expecting perhaps a message from my neighbor or one of the women from church. Instead, I saw the familiar names, Daniel and Lydia. But it wasn't a message to me. It was a notification. They had posted new photos. I hesitated, my finger trembling over the screen, but curiosity clawed harder than pride. And then, with one tap, my world split open. There they were, Daniel and Lydia, smiling as though they'd won the lottery, standing arm in arm before a sprawling country mansion with white stone walls and ivy climbing gracefully along the sides. Lydia wore a wide sun hat and a dress that looked too expensive for her. Her lips curled into that practiced smile she always wore for the camera. Daniel looked younger somehow, carefree, as though life had never placed a burden on his shoulders. Photo after photo scrolled before my eyes. Them lounging by the pool with cocktails in hand, them riding horses across emerald fields, them dining on meals served on gleaming silver platters. Their captions were cruel in their carelessness. Living the dream, 30 days in paradise, couldn't ask for more. Blessed beyond words, thank you life. Not one mention of me, not a single acknowledgement that they were enjoying what had been mine. My chest tightened until I thought I might faint. I set the phone down, but it buzzed again and again as their friends commented with hearts and praises, envy dripping from every word. Each notification was another nail hammered into me. I curled into myself, pressing the quilt tighter around my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wept until I couldn't breathe. I wasn't just grieving the trip. I was grieving the love I thought still lived in my son. By the time the tears stopped, night had fallen. My house felt unbearably silent, the kind of silence that gnaws at you. My stomach ached, my head throbbed. I tried to stand, but found myself dizzy, my knees buckling beneath me. The next morning, weakness still clung to me like a heavy cloak. I decided to call Daniel. My hands shook as I dialed his number. It rang 3 times before he answered, his voice bright and carefree. "Mom, what's up?" I swallowed hard. "Daniel, I'm not feeling well. I think I need to go to the hospital. Could you come?" His laughter cut me off. Not warm laughter, not even surprised laughter. Cruel laughter. "Mom, you always overreact. What is it this time? A little cold? You'll be fine. You're tough, remember?" My throat burned. "Daniel, please. I'm dizzy. I can barely stand. I just need—" He sighed, and I could almost see him rolling his eyes. "Look, Mom, I can't deal with this right now. Lydia and I are about to head out for a boat ride. You'll be fine. Drink some tea or something." And then the final blow, delivered with a chuckle so light it nearly unmade me. "You're old, Mom. Old people get sick all the time. That's just how it is." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there, phone pressed against my ear, hearing only the hollow silence. For a long moment, I couldn't move. His words echoed in my skull, louder than any storm, sharper than any knife. "You're old." I thought of the years I'd given him, every sacrifice, every late night of work, every time I went without so he could have more. I thought of the house he lived in, bought with money from my savings, the car he drove, insured with my name on the policy, even that shiny watch he wore in one of the photos, a birthday gift from me. And now I was nothing. Just a burden, just an old woman, brushed aside like dust. That night, when the weakness in my body forced me to call an ambulance, I went alone. The flashing red lights outside my window illuminated the walls of my empty home. No family followed me into the sterile halls of the hospital. No son held my hand. No daughter-in-law whispered words of comfort. I lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and strangers in white coats, with only my thoughts to keep me company. Thoughts that twisted, darkened, hardened. I realized something in that moment, something that settled into me like a stone. They had taken my trip, my joy, my dignity. They had laughed at my pain, mocked my age, abandoned me when I needed them most. But they had forgotten one very important detail. Everything they owned, their house, their car, their savings, had come from me. And, unlike a vacation prize, those things could be taken back. As I closed my eyes in the dim hospital room, a spark of strength lit inside me. Not the foolish hope of before, but something colder, sharper. Revenge was still far off, hidden behind the curtain of my weakness. But I would wait. I would heal. And when the time came, I would take back everything. Hospitals have a way of swallowing time. Days bled into each other like watercolors on a wet canvas, the light from the window shifting from dawn to dusk while I lay tethered to IV lines and the quiet hum of machines. The nurses were kind in the detached way professionals are. They brought me water, adjusted my blankets, asked how I felt. But their smiles, however genuine, could not replace the warmth of family. They couldn't erase the sting of knowing that I had one son in this world, and he hadn't even called to ask how I was. At night, when the ward grew quiet and the footsteps faded, I stared at the pale ceiling and replayed his voice in my mind. "You're old, Mom." The words slithered through me like poison. Each repetition stripped another layer of tenderness from my heart, leaving something harder, sharper behind. On the third day, my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, visited. A plump, gray-haired woman with gentle eyes, she placed a bouquet of daisies on my bedside table. "Julia, dear, when I saw the ambulance lights, I feared the worst. How are you holding up?" I tried to smile, but it wavered. "I've been better." She patted my hand. "And your son? Has he been by?" That question broke something in me. My throat tightened. "No, he hasn't." Mrs. Henderson's eyes clouded with sorrow. She didn't press further, but the pity in her gaze was unbearable. I almost preferred Daniel's cruelty to her sympathy. Cruelty hardened me. Pity made me feel small. That evening, when she left, I turned back to my phone, my one connection to the world outside these sterile walls. Against my better judgment, I opened social media. And there they were again. Daniel and Lydia, draped across lounge chairs, the mansion's pool glittering behind them. Her skin glowed with sun, her smile wide, while Daniel raised a glass to the camera. The caption read, "Living like royalty. Thank you, universe, for this perfect life." I wanted to throw the phone across the room. My hands shook, but I held on to it, scrolling through the comments. Their friends cheered them on. So jealous. Couple goals. You two deserve it all. Not a single soul knew the truth, that the perfect life they flaunted wasn't theirs. It had been stolen from me. The injustice burned hotter than the IV needle in my arm. My chest ached, but not from illness anymore. It was rage, pure and raw. For the first time, I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered into the silence of my hospital room, my voice low, steady. "They think they've won. They think I'm weak. But they've forgotten. Everything they own came from me." The words echoed off the white walls, and I felt something shift inside. The next morning, a young doctor came in, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Thomas, your condition is stable. You'll need rest, but you'll recover. Recover. The word pulsed in me like a heartbeat. Recovery didn't just mean my body. It meant my spirit, my pride, my dignity. As the days passed, I used the quiet to think. I thought of the years I spent saving every penny to buy Daniel his first home. How I had signed the documents, knowing the house was legally mine until he could stand on his own feet. I thought of the car, too, registered in my name, the insurance tied to my accounts. Even their so-called savings had been seeded with my money when Daniel and Lydia married because I didn't want them to start their life together burdened by debt. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer. They weren't standing on their own, they were standing on me. And I realized, with cold clarity, that I still held the foundation. The documents, the ownership, the proof, it all remained with me. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. For the first time since the betrayal, I didn't feel powerless. They were parading in paradise, blind in their arrogance. Meanwhile, I was quietly sharpening my weapons. When I left this hospital, I wouldn't return to the woman who cried into her quilt or begged her son for kindness. No, I would return as someone far stronger, someone they would never see coming. Because revenge doesn't bloom in noise or fire. It grows in silence, in patience, and mine was beginning to take root. The day they discharged me, the sky was gray, heavy with the kind of clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. A nurse wheeled me to the hospital doors that I insisted on standing on my own. My legs trembled as if they carried not just my body, but the weight of all my sorrows. Still, I straightened my back and stepped outside. The world looked different now. The same streets, the same familiar sidewalks, yet I no longer walked them as the same woman. The Julia who had been soft, forgiving, and patient had been buried in that hospital bed. What rose in her place was leaner, sharper, and far less willing to be trampled. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, met me at the curb. "You shouldn't be alone," she said, opening the passenger door of her old sedan. "Come, I'll drive you home." Home. The word caught in my throat as I lowered myself into the seat. What kind of home was it now? Four walls that had once echoed with laughter, with Daniel's boyish voice, with holidays and warmth, and now nothing but silence. When we pulled into the driveway, I felt the emptiness before I even stepped inside. The house greeted me with cold stillness. Dust lay across the furniture. The curtains sagged, untouched. I placed my hand on the kitchen counter, studying myself, and let the loneliness seep in. Mrs. Henderson fussed over me for a while, filling the fridge with leftovers and straightening up, but eventually she had to leave. When the door shut behind her, the silence deepened. I moved through the house slowly, pausing in each room. Photographs lined the walls. Daniel as a boy, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a muddy frog. Daniel at graduation, his cap askew. Daniel with Lydia on their wedding day, both of them glowing with youth and promise. I touched the frame of that last photo, tracing their smiles. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, pale and weary. They had taken the trip, the laughter, the fun, but here was the truth, frozen in paper and ink. Everything they had was built on what I had given. Later that evening, I sat in the armchair near the window, wrapped in a shawl. I turned on the television, but I wasn't watching. Instead, I scrolled through my phone, drawn like a moth to the flame of their social media pages. There they were again, Lydia in a silk dress, her hair curled, posing against the mansion's grand staircase. Daniel by the pool, tanned and relaxed, with a caption, "Life's too short not to enjoy it to the fullest." I let out a bitter laugh. They were enjoying my prize, my reward. While I lay in a hospital bed, they sipped champagne under chandeliers. But as much as the images stung, I studied them carefully.
Each photo was proof of their arrogance. Each boastful caption was another nail they hammered into their own coffin. They didn't realize they were documenting the very thing that would destroy them. I set the phone down and went to the drawer in my desk. Inside, neatly stacked, were the documents I had kept for years. Property deeds, car registrations, bank statements, all in my name. My fingers lingered on the crisped edges of the papers. I felt the power in them, quiet and absolute. They were my shield, my sword. The night grew darker, but I didn't turn on the light. I sat there in the dim glow of the desk lamp, rereading every line of those documents. My heartbeat steadied with each page. For years, I had thought of these papers as simple protection, a way to keep my family secure. I had never imagined they would become my weapon. But now, the thought settled into me like iron. Daniel and Lydia had underestimated me. They thought my age made me weak, that my love made me blind. They were wrong. I folded the documents back into their envelopes and placed them in a locked box. Then I whispered to the empty house, the sound steady and calm. They've had their fun, but the bill is coming due. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because the loneliness had lifted, but because I had found purpose. The game had begun. The next morning, a heavy rain beat against the roof, rattling the gutters and blurring the view outside. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table, watching the gray sheets of water sweep across the yard. The world smelled of wet earth and pine, clean, honest smells. I breathed them in deeply. I needed clarity now more than ever. I took a notebook from the drawer, one of those plain ones with lined pages. On the first sheet, in bold, shaky letters, I wrote, "What they did to me." And then I listed it. Every betrayal, every insult, every abandonment. They took my prize trip for themselves. They flaunted it online while I was in the hospital. They never visited me. Daniel laughed when I begged him to come. They left me alone, sick and helpless. The list grew darker with every word. My pen dug into the paper until it nearly tore. On the next page, I wrote, "What they don't know." And here I listed what belonged to me. Every deed, every property, every account. Each one a reminder that, legally and financially, I still held the power. They could laugh, they could strut, but they were standing on ground that I owned. The rain continued, steady as a drumbeat. It was as though nature itself was hammering the truth into me. Patience, strength, timing. By late afternoon, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. Her voice was warm on the other end of the line. "Julia, how are you feeling, dear?" "I'm alive," I said simply, "but I need your help, not for charity, for truth." She hesitated, but she didn't turn me down. She came over an hour later, bringing with her a tin of cornbread and the kind of quiet loyalty that only comes with age and shared hardship. We sat in my living room, the lamp casting a golden glow over us. I showed her the documents. Her eyes widened as she flipped through them. "Julia, this is everything. You own it all." "Yes," I said, sipping my tea. "And they don't even realize how precarious their lives are. They think I'm weak, Henderson. They think I'll die quietly in some hospital bed while they live off the fruits of my labor." Mrs. Henderson set down the papers and looked at me steadily. "Then you need a lawyer, someone who knows how to cut them down to size." Her words struck deep. She was right. I couldn't do this alone. That night, when she left, I searched through my old address book until I found a number I hadn't dialed in years. Thomas Whitaker, my late husband's lawyer. A stern but fair man, sharp as a blade. I wasn't sure if he was still practicing, but I dialed anyway. The line clicked after the third ring. "Whitaker Law," a deep voice answered. I swallowed. "Thomas, it's Julia Morris." There was a pause, then a surprised chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. Julia Morris. It's been decades. To what do I owe this call? I closed my eyes, steadying myself. I need your help. My son and his wife, they've betrayed me, and I won't let it go unpunished. His tone shifted instantly, all warmth gone. Come by tomorrow. Bring everything. We'll see what we can do. When I hung up, my hands trembled. Not from fear this time, but from anticipation. I spent the rest of the evening gathering documents, stacking them neatly into folders. Each paper was a stone, and together they were becoming a fortress. Before bed, I checked my phone again. Daniel had posted a new photo. Him and Lydia on horseback, riding across green fields, her laughter captured midair. The caption read, "Living our best life, no matter what anyone thinks." I stared at it for a long time, then set the phone down slowly. "No matter what anyone thinks?" I whispered into the quiet room. A grim smile touched my lips. We'll see about that. That night, I dreamt not of betrayal, but of storm clouds breaking and lightning striking exactly where it was meant to.
The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the air sharp and clean. I woke early, nerves thrumming in my veins. For the first time in weeks, I felt alive with purpose. My body ached, but I forced myself through a slow breakfast, drinking tea as though it were fuel. By 10 o'clock, I was standing outside the old law office on Main Street. The building looked much the same as it had when I last walked through its doors with my late husband so many years ago. The bricks were faded, and the sign above the door had begun to peel, but the sight steadied me. It reminded me of a time when we were strong, when everything we owned had been built with sweat and care. Inside, the familiar smell of leather and paper greeted me. Thomas Whitaker hadn't changed much, though his hair was now completely white. He rose from behind his desk and came around to shake my hand, his grip still firm, his eyes still sharp. "Julia Morris," he said, with the kind of voice that could cut through fog. "What's been done to you?" I sat across from him, clutching my folder of documents. My son and his wife, they think I'm finished. They took from me, mocked me, left me to rot while they enjoyed what I earned, and I won't allow it. He leaned back, folding his hands across his stomach, listening carefully. I told him everything. How Dandel and Lydia had stolen my prize trip, how they'd paraded their joy on social media while I lay sick in a hospital bed, how Daniel had laughed when I called him in desperation. With every word, Thomas's expression grew harder, his jaw tightening like stone. When I finished, I laid the deeds and financial papers before him. "They don't realize all of this is mine," I said quietly. "Every house, every piece of land, every account. It's in my name, and I want to make sure they never touch another cent of it again." Thomas went through the papers with practiced hands, scanning them with a precision that comforted me. Finally, he looked up. "Julia, you've been wronged, and I don't say this lightly. You have every legal right to take back what's yours. The law is on your side." A warmth spread through my chest, not happiness exactly, but a deep reassurance. For the first time since that wretched day in the hospital, I didn't feel entirely alone. "Will it be difficult?" I asked. He gave me a look that carried both warning and promise. "They'll fight, and it will get ugly. But if you're prepared to endure, we can strip them down to nothing but their pride." The words settled in me like iron. Endure. Yes, I had endured my whole life. Betrayal was only another storm. We spoke for hours, plotting the first steps. He advised me to stay quiet for now, to gather more evidence, to let Daniel and Lydia believe I remained weak and broken. Their arrogance would be their undoing, he said. I nodded, the plan already weaving itself into my thoughts like a net. When I finally left the office, the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the wet pavement with gold. I clutched my folder tightly to my chest, as though it were a shield. Back home, I sat on the porch and opened my phone again. Another post had appeared.
Lydia was lounging beside a pool in a silk robe, a glass of champagne in her hand, her nails painted a glimmering shade of red. Daniel was grinning behind her, showing off his designer watch, the caption beneath the photo declaring that they were finally living the life they deserved. My hand shook as I stared at the screen, not from weakness this time, but from the fury I kept buried so deep inside. They deserved this life, did they? They deserved to waste what they never built, to trample over the one who gave them everything? I set the phone down on the table beside me and closed my eyes. In the silence of the evening, I could almost hear my late husband's voice. He would have said, "Julia, don't waste your anger on tears. Turn it into something sharp, something that cuts." And that was exactly what I intended to do. That night, as I drifted into sleep, I no longer felt like a woman abandoned and humiliated. I felt like a woman sharpening her blade in the dark.
The days that followed felt strangely calm, though beneath the surface a storm was tightening. I moved through my routines as though nothing had changed, watering my small garden, buying groceries, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors who knew nothing of the turmoil within my family. On the outside, I remained the same aging widow. Inside, I was holding a secret as sharp as glass. Daniel and Lydia, meanwhile, grew bolder. Every day seemed to bring new photographs online. I saw them dining in candlelit restaurants, their plates covered with meals so elaborate they looked more like works of art than food. I saw them grinning on horseback, Daniel holding the reins like some lord of the land, Lydia lifting her chin as if she had been born into nobility. They were living on stolen joy, and worse, they wanted the world to see it. One evening, I overheard two women talking near the pharmacy. They were giggling over a picture of Lydia draped across a velvet sofa, her bare legs stretched out while Daniel poured champagne into her glass. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to stand quietly and listen. The women whispered about how lucky Lydia was, how handsome Daniel had become, how enviable their lives looked. And then one of them laughed and said, "Can you believe his mother, old Julia, stuck at home while they shine like stars? She must be so proud." The words struck me like a blade. Proud? I bit my lips so hard I tasted blood. Proud of what? Betrayal? Proud that my son had abandoned me for vanity and greed? No, there was no pride left in me, only fire. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my armchair with the folder of documents resting in my lap, running my fingers over the embossed seals. These were my weapons, stronger than any sword. Everything they flaunted was built on the foundation of what I had provided. Without me, they would be nothing but two foolish children with empty hands. I whispered it aloud to myself, testing the sound of the words. "Without me, you are nothing." The sentence hung in the stillness of the room like a vow. But patience was needed. Thomas had been clear. Silence was my greatest advantage. So I played my part, letting Daniel believe I was weak. When he finally called one afternoon, his voice full of that patronizing tone he reserved for me, I almost laughed. He asked if I was managing my bills, whether I needed him to take over more of the paperwork. The mockery dripped from every syllable. "I'm fine," I said, my voice steady, my words deliberate. "You should enjoy your time, Daniel. Don't worry about me." He chuckled softly, the way men do when they think they've already won. "I'll always take care of things, Mom. You don't need to trouble yourself." When he hung up, I sat in the silence for a long while, the echo of his arrogance still buzzing in my ears. He truly believed I was blind, fragile, incapable of standing on my own. He didn't realize he was handing me every thread of rope I would one day pull tight around his ambitions. Later that week, I saw them again. Not in person, but in a video clip someone had shared. They were standing at the gates of the mansion that had been part of the prize I had rightfully won. Daniel's arm was slung around Lydia's shoulders as they waved to the camera, calling it their dream home getaway. My heart pounded as I watched them.
Lydia twirled in front of the grand entrance, her laughter shrill, her words cruel as she said, "Finally, we're living the life old Julia never could." I replayed that sentence again and again, not because I wanted to suffer, but because I needed to etch it into my mind. That humiliation, that ridicule, it would be the very stone upon which their downfall was carved. As the days turned into weeks, I kept my distance, watching, listening, saving every post, every careless word. They believed themselves untouchable, and in their belief, they were already laying the foundation of their ruin. I told no one of my visits to the lawyer, no one of the documents carefully hidden in my bedroom drawer. Let the world think Julia was a lonely, old woman too frail to fight. Let Daniel and Lydia think I was powerless. For when the time came, the mask would fall, and they would discover what it meant to betray a woman who had given everything and lost nothing but her illusions. That night, as I blew out the lamp beside my bed, I lay down not as a victim, but as a hunter waiting for the right moment. The shadows of the room whispered to me like companions, "Soon, Julia, soon."
The chill of autumn settled over the town, and with it came an ache in my bones that refused to let go. I had always been strong, always prided myself on working hard, cooking my own meals, tending to my little garden without help. But now, there were mornings when my legs trembled just carrying me from the bedroom to the kitchen. The hospital stay had taken more from me than I wanted to admit. My body whispered its frailty, though my mind burned brighter than ever. One evening, after nearly collapsing while sweeping the porch, I had to face the truth. I needed help, medical help. Reluctantly, I went to the hospital for another checkup. The fluorescent lights above me hummed like bees, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my lungs. A nurse with kind eyes fussed over me, and the doctor finally said what I had feared. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and stress had all taken their toll. "You need rest," he told me gently, as if speaking to a child. "No more overexertion. If you push yourself too hard, you'll only make things worse." Rest? How could I rest when betrayal clung to me like a parasite? How could I rest when my own blood was living in comfort, drinking wine in the mansion that should have been mine? That night in the hospital bed, I stared at the ceiling tiles and listened to the beeping of the machines around me. I thought of Daniel as a boy, how he used to bring me wildflowers from the field and place them in a cup by the window. I thought of how I had sacrificed every comfort to give him opportunities, how I had carried the weight of our lives alone when his father passed. And now, in my weakest hour, he had not even come to see me. The next morning, with trembling hands, I dialed his number. The phone rang, and finally, his voice came through, clear and smug. "Daniel," I whispered, my throat raw. "I'm in the hospital again. Could you come, just for a while?" There was silence on the line, followed by the faint sound of laughter in the background, Lydia's laughter. Then Daniel's voice, dripping with cruelty I had never heard so openly before. "Mom, you'll be fine. You always bounce back. Besides, Lydia and I are busy. Don't call me for every little ache. You're old. This is what happens. Get used to it." I froze, gripping the receiver until my knuckles turned white. Busy? They were busy clinking glasses of champagne, no doubt, while I lay alone, tubes in my arms, machines breathing alongside me. He chuckled softly before hanging up, as if the conversation had been nothing more than an inconvenience. The line went dead, and I sat there in stunned silence. For a moment, the weight of despair crushed me so fully I could hardly breathe. But then, something shifted. The pain in my chest hardened into something else. Not grief, not weakness, but fury. They had ridiculed me, abandoned me, treated me as though I were already in the grave. That was their mistake. I was not finished. I was not gone. And if my body was failing me, then my mind would carry me the rest of the way. When I was discharged days later, I returned home with a determination sharper than ever. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and pen,
outlining every step I needed to take. The documents were already mine, safely locked away. The lawyer was ready. The only thing left was timing. Daniel and Lydia believed I was dying. They believed the illness and the loneliness would silence me forever. I would let them believe that. I would let them mock me, let them show the world their arrogance. For every smile they posted, every cruel word they spoke, they were digging their own graves. I looked at my reflection in the window that night, the lines of age deepening my face, the gray strands glinting in the glass. For the first time, I didn't see weakness. I saw a woman forged in fire, a mother who had given everything and who now had nothing left to lose. And I whispered to my reflection, to the ghost of the woman they thought they could bury. You wanted me gone, Daniel, but I'm still here. And when I rise, you will fall.
The days after my discharge stretched long and heavy, but I refused to let them pass in idleness. My body demanded rest, yet my spirit was restless, unwilling to sit still while Daniel and Lydia paraded through life as if they had already buried me. Every photograph they posted from that mansion I had won made its way to me through whispers in town. People spoke of it in the market, shaking their heads with pity in their eyes when they saw me hunched over a basket of vegetables. I hated their pity more than anything. The first real step I took was calling Margaret, an old friend from my church days. She had always been sharp, a woman with a nose for gossip, but also a heart that never failed me. She came to my home one afternoon, bringing with her a basket of fruit and that same piercing gaze she'd carried since girlhood. "Julia," she said as soon as she sat down, "I know what's been happening. I've seen the pictures. That boy of yours, he's forgotten who raised him." I lowered my eyes to the teacup in my hands. He hasn't just forgotten Margaret, he's chosen to erase me altogether. Margaret reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. Then you remind him, you've got more fight in you than both of them put together. Her words lodged in me like a spark, small but bright. I told her about the documents, how everything Daniel flaunted actually belonged to me, how I had signed the purchase agreements, how every brick of that property had been secured with my savings. Margaret's eyes widened, then narrowed in the way they always did when she smelled trouble. "You're sitting on a hammer, Julia," she whispered, "and they don't even know it." That evening after she left, I sat at my kitchen table again, running my fingers over the folder that contained my papers. Deeds, bank receipts, signatures, proof. My hands trembled as I held them, but not from weakness. It was the tremor of power returning, of control shifting slowly back into my grasp. Days passed, my strength grew, and so did their arrogance. Lydia, bold as a queen, posted videos of herself lounging by the mansion's pool, sipping wine in silk robes. Daniel, once the boy who kissed my hand before bed, now strutted across social media with expensive watches gleaming on his wrist. They laughed into cameras, shared to the world that life was perfect. I wondered if their followers noticed the shadows behind their smiles, the rot beneath the glitter. Because I saw it. I could almost smell their fear beneath the vanity. They thought I was too weak, too broken to fight. One Sunday, as I left church with Margaret, I overheard a conversation that made my chest tighten. Two women were speaking at the steps, their voices low, but not low enough. "Did you hear, poor Julia, her son and that young wife of his, living in her prize mansion while she shuffles around sick? They don't even visit her. It's shameful." "They'll regret it one day," the other woman said. "The Lord doesn't bless cruelty." I turned away before they saw the tears forming in my eyes. It wasn't pity that filled me this time, but a strange kind of vindication. People were seeing the truth, even if Daniel and Lydia thought they could hide it. Their cruelty wasn't just known to me anymore. It was seeping out into the world. That night, lying in bed, I felt my body ache, but my soul settle into something steady. I wasn't alone. I had Margaret, I had my church, and soon I would have the courts. But I knew I couldn't strike yet, not too early. Revenge, once rushed, loses its power.
No, I had to wait until their arrogance reached its peak, until they were certain I was finished. Then, when they least expected it, I would rise. I looked at the ceiling, my lips parting in a whisper meant for no one but myself. They think they've written my ending, but my story is just beginning.
The crisp air of late autumn seemed sharper than usual as I walked through the small park near my home. The leaves, brilliant shades of orange and red, swirled around my feet in the gusts of wind, and for a moment I let myself watch them, letting the cold bite into my cheeks. It reminded me that the world kept moving, indifferent to cruelty or sorrow, and that I too had to keep moving. In the days that followed, I felt a subtle change within myself. The hospital stay, the neglect, the betrayal, they had worn me down, but now I discovered a strength that had been buried under years of quiet obedience and sacrifice. I could still hold my head high, still walk steadily, still look people in the eye, and know I belonged in this world. My body ached less, my hands steadied, and my mind sharpened. The fire in me, once dimmed by despair, now glowed steadily, feeding on the injustices I had endured. Daniel and Lydia, oblivious to the storm gathering in my chest, continued their reckless display. That week, I received a notification from a local cafe where I sometimes had tea. The staff had seen them walking arm in arm, laughing loudly, and they had asked if I wanted to see the photos. The images were infuriating. Daniel tipping a waiter with a flamboyant smile, Lydia twirling in her silk dress as if the world belonged to them. Their arrogance seemed to mock every memory of my care, my work, my sacrifices. And yet, as I stared at the screen, I realized something crucial. Every careless smile, every boastful post, every public display of wealth, they were leaving a trail of arrogance, of entitlement, of exposure. If I waited, if I watched carefully, I could gather the evidence I would need to reclaim what was rightfully mine. One morning, a neighbor approached me while I watered my small garden. Her voice was low but insistent. "Julia, I saw them at the market yesterday. Lydia bragging about the house and Daniel waving checks around. People are talking. You know this isn't right." I nodded, brushing soil from my hands. "I know," I said simply, "and soon they'll understand." Later that evening, I found myself alone in my living room, documents spread across the table. I had spent hours reviewing purchase agreements, bank statements, and property deeds. Everything was in my name. Every property, every account, every piece of land had been secured through my own efforts and money. Daniel and Lydia had only taken what I allowed them to see, thinking they could manipulate it. They had never anticipated that I would study, plan, and wait. That night, as I prepared a simple meal, my thoughts kept returning to them. I remembered the laughter at the hospital, Daniel's cruel words, Lydia's arrogance. They had believed I was powerless, old, infirm, a woman who could be dismissed with a few jokes and a careless call. They had no idea how much patience I could wield, how much planning I could endure, how deeply a woman who has been wronged could wait for the moment to reclaim her life. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was filled not with dreams but with strategies. I envisioned the court, the papers, the lawyer Thomas preparing every detail. I imagined the moment Bay would realize that their laughter had been premature, that the life they flaunted was built on a foundation they did not own. And I smiled, quietly, savoring the thought of their shock, their helplessness when confronted with the truth. When I awoke the next morning, the sun streaming weakly through the clouds, I felt a surge of energy. The weeks of humiliation, neglect, and betrayal had not diminished me. They had forged me into something stronger, something deliberate, something patient. I was ready to act when the time came. For now, I waited, watched, and let them continue their careless display. Their arrogance would be the key to their undoing, and I would ensure it opened the door to my victory.
The days grew colder, the wind slicing through the streets like a sharpened blade.
but I moved through the world with a calm determination that kept the chill from catching me. Every morning, I pored over the documents again, checking signatures, bank records, property deeds. Thomas had advised patience, and I had taken it to heart. I would not rush. I would wait until their arrogance blinded them completely, until they believed I was still the frail, dependent woman they had tried to mock into silence. Daniel and Lydia had not slowed their display of wealth. One afternoon, as I walked past the local cafe to pick up a few groceries, I saw Lydia leaning against the hood of a new sports car, her phone held high as she took selfies. Daniel laughed loudly beside her, clearly performing for an unseen audience. The air smelled faintly of rain and exhaust, a mixture that somehow matched the sourness in my chest. People walking by whispered, some with pity, others with barely concealed amusement. And still, they thought they had conquered me. Back at home, I sat at my desk, the soft light of the lamp spilling across the papers. I could almost hear their laughter in my mind, mocking me, daring me to rise. I let the memories wash over me, but did not allow them to break my focus. Instead, I mapped out every piece of property, every account, every transaction Daniel and Lydia had touched. I made notes, meticulously connecting the dots, visualizing the court procedures, the legal moves Thomas would make. It was during one of these late nights, when the house was quiet and the wind rattled the windows, that I received an unexpected visitor. Margaret, ever vigilant, came to my door, her eyes sharp, her voice hushed. "Julia, you need to be careful. They're talking. Daniel has been boasting to neighbors, telling them you're too weak to even manage your own affairs. Lydia is painting herself as the lady of the house everywhere." I nodded, listening. "Let them talk," I said quietly. "It only makes their fall louder when it comes." She studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "You've changed. You've become unstoppable. Just promise me you'll not lose yourself in anger. Be smart. Wait for the right moment." I smiled faintly. "I've waited my whole life for this, Margaret. I can wait a little longer." That evening, I returned to my routine of reviewing every transaction, making mental notes of every careless mistake they had made, every signature they had forged, every boast that left evidence behind. The mansion, the properties, the accounts, they were all illusions built on my generosity and their arrogance. I would unravel it all, piece by piece. And as I sat there, with the wind rattling the windows and the old clock ticking steadily beside me, I realized how calm I had become. There was no desperation, no fear, only a cold, focused patience. I could see the plan unfolding, the moment when Daniel and Lydia would realize their lives of luxury had been built on nothing more than their own assumptions. Soon, very soon, I would act, and when that day came, they would understand the true meaning of betrayal and the full weight of a mother's quiet, relentless resolve. Winter arrived with a biting wind that swept through the streets, rattling windows and twisting the bare branches of the trees outside my home. I felt it not only in my bones, but in the very rhythm of the town, as if nature itself recognized the tension that had settled between me and my family. Each day, I moved with purpose, carefully plotting the steps that would lead to the reckoning they did not see coming. I had spent weeks quietly gathering every piece of evidence: bank statements showing the loans taken out in my name, receipts for purchases I had never authorized, documents proving Lydia's ownership of the mansion, and the falsified signatures Daniel had used in his arrogance. Each piece of paper, each record, was a thread I could pull to unravel the illusion they had built around themselves. I spread them across my dining table, creating a map of their deceit. The audacity of their betrayal still burned within me. I thought of Daniel laughing at the hospital, mocking my age, and Lydia posting selfies in the mansion I had won fair and square. Their cruelty was almost theatrical, as though the world were their stage and I had been relegated to the background, a figure to be laughed at.
And yet, in their arrogance, they left footprints of their crime, unaware that someone was watching. That morning, I called Thomas, my lawyer, and we began the first careful steps. Each motion, each filing had to be precise. Any misstep would give them ammunition, and I could not allow them even that. I instructed him to draft a formal request for an audit of all transactions linked to my accounts, to investigate the loans Daniel had taken in my name, and to verify property ownership. The law would be my instrument, meticulous and unyielding. Meanwhile, life outside my home continued its cruel theater. I saw their faces in town, grinning, showing off, oblivious to the storm that was gathering. Lydia waved from her car at the supermarket parking lot, her laughter carrying far, a mocking echo of the life she believed she had stolen. Daniel strutted behind her, confident, arrogant, blind to the fact that the foundation of their empire was already cracking beneath them. One evening, as I walked through the frozen garden, the wind tugging at my scarf and the last light fading behind the hills, I felt a moment of clarity unlike anything before. My anger was no longer just anger. It had become strategy, cold and precise. Every insult they had thrown, every humiliation I had endured had been recorded, remembered, and transformed into leverage. This was not merely revenge. This was justice, meticulously earned, and I would savor the moment when the truth struck them blind. Margaret stopped by that evening, bearing tea in her hands and the steady look of someone who had witnessed my transformation. "You've changed, Julia," she said quietly. "You're no longer the same woman they think they can push around." I accepted the tea and smiled faintly. No, I'm not. And soon they'll learn that the mistake they made was underestimating me. Every piece of their arrogance is about to become my advantage. That night, I reviewed the files once more, making careful notes and marking the documents that would prove their deception. The loans, the forged signatures, the ownership of the mansion, they had left no stone unturned in their display of entitlement, and each stone was now a stepping stone to their undoing. I imagined the court, the moment the judge would look over the evidence, the shock in Daniel's eyes, Lydia's gasp as the truth unfolded. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I felt no fear, only resolve. For the first time in months, I could rest in the certainty that my patience, my meticulous planning, and my unwavering will had created something unstoppable. Daniel and Lydia had believed they were untouchable, but the reckoning was coming, and there would be no mercy. I placed my hand over the documents one final time that night, whispering to myself, not as the frail, overlooked woman they had mocked, but as a mother who had been betrayed and had learned the full measure of her own strength. Soon, I said, the word a promise, a warning, a vow. Soon, they will see the cost of their arrogance.
The day began with an unseasonable stillness, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and demands attention. I woke early, long before the sun had risen, and sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the documents I had been collecting for months. The papers felt heavy beneath my hands, but in that weight there was power, a silent promise that the humiliation, the abandonment, the betrayal would not go unanswered. I dressed carefully, each movement deliberate, feeling the anticipation coil inside me like a living thing. Margaret arrived soon after, her presence steady and reassuring. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, though my pulse had already quickened. Today, patience would yield to action. The first step was formal and calculated. Thomas had prepared the paperwork: affidavits, notarized statements, bank records, proof of loans Daniel had taken out in my name, documents showing Lydia's fraudulent claims to the mansion, and even emails where Daniel and Lydia flaunted their deception. With each page, each stamp, each signature, I felt the years of humiliation dissolve, replaced by a quiet, unwavering determination.
We arrived at the courthouse mid-morning, the winter air sharp against my cheeks. Daniel and Lydia were already there, laughing at something I could not hear, confident as ever. Their arrogance made them easy to find, and it made their eventual shock inevitable. They barely glanced at me as I walked past, a deliberate display of the same dismissal they had shown for months. Inside, the court felt cold and vast, its high ceilings amplifying every step I took. I presented the evidence methodically, each document telling the story I had endured, each record a mirror reflecting their own greed. Daniel's jaw tightened as Thomas explained the loans, the forged signatures, the misappropriated funds. Lydia's smile faltered when confronted with proof that the mansion she had claimed as her own was legally mine. "You have no right to these accusations," Daniel blurted, his voice cracking under the first strain of panic. "Mom, this is insane. These are your documents? This can't be real." "It is real," I said calmly, my eyes steady on his. "Everything here is true. Every word, every signature, every transaction you tried to hide." Lydia tried to interrupt, but Thomas held up his hand, silencing her. The room was still, the air thick with tension, and for the first time in months, I felt the full weight of control shift into my hands. They had mocked me, ignored me, laughed at my illness, and yet, here I stood, evidence in hand, eyes unyielding. The judge reviewed the files carefully, asking pointed questions about the loans and property transactions. Daniel's face paled, and Lydia's composure crumbled as the reality of exposure sank in. I watched them squirm, felt the satisfaction deepen with each hesitation, each faltering excuse. They had thought me weak, invisible, irrelevant. They were wrong. By the end of the hearing, the verdict was clear. The loans were transferred to Daniel, who was now responsible for the debts he had incurred fraudulently. Lydia's claim to the mansion was invalidated, and ownership returned to me. Every property she had assumed was hers by deceit was legally restored under my name. They were stripped of their entitlement, forced to confront the consequences of their arrogance. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter, as if the wind itself had shifted to celebrate a victory hard-earned. I walked slowly, Margaret by my side, feeling the winter sun warm my face despite the chill. For the first time in months, I did not feel the weight of betrayal pressing against me. I had endured, planned, waited, and now I had prevailed. Daniel and Lydia were forced into a quiet retreat, humiliated in public, their false confidence shattered. People whispered, some with shock, some with admiration, and I held my head high. The revenge was not cruel. It was just, meticulous, and complete. That evening, as I returned home, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The documents were locked safely away, the property secured, the debts transferred. The storm that had raged around me for months was finally quiet, leaving only the clarity of justice served. I allowed myself a smile, one that spoke not of triumph over others, but of the restoration of my own dignity. I had endured betrayal, humiliation, and neglect. I had waited patiently, silently, while they flaunted their false victories. And now, at last, I could breathe, knowing that justice, at long last, had been restored.
The first morning after the court's verdict felt strangely serene. The winter sun poured weakly through the curtains, casting long shadows across the living room where I sat quietly, a cup of tea warming my hands. For months, I had carried the weight of betrayal, of laughter and neglect, but now there was a subtle lightness, a shift in the air that felt almost tangible. Daniel and Lydia's world, once flaunted and untouchable, had collapsed under the truth, and it was as if the very city itself recognized the change. I walked through my home, touching the surfaces I had once feared were lost. My study, my garden, the corner of the living room where the winter sun always fell just right. Everything now carried the sense of rightful ownership, a quiet affirmation that the battles I had endured were not in vain. Papers that had once been symbols of manipulation and deceit were now safe in my hands, each document a monument to patience and resilience. Yet victory was not meant to make me complacent. Daniel and Lydia had been humiliated publicly, but their arrogance had not entirely dissolved. I could feel it lingering in the way neighbors whispered when they saw them, how some people offered half-sympathetic glances at the pair, struggling to regain footing in a world they had taken for granted. I had won the court's decision, but their attitude needed correction beyond the legal realm. I began taking steps to ensure they could no longer flaunt any semblance of superiority. Lydia, who had once ordered me around with her sharp tone and cruel laughter, was now forced to navigate life without her ill-gotten luxuries. I watched quietly as she started working at a small boutique, her confidence shrinking each day under the weight of tasks she had never imagined performing. Daniel, stripped of both his financial power and the delusion of control, had to seek employment for the first time in years. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling, and it satisfied something that the court alone could not. People in the town began noticing the change. The whispers that once painted me as weak and frail were replaced by stories of my persistence, my strategy, and the careful precision with which I had restored my life. I overheard neighbors discussing the audacity of Daniel and Lydia's fall, and it brought a subtle smile to my lips. It was not cruelty that fueled me now, but a sense of justice unfolding naturally. Meanwhile, I allowed myself to breathe, to rebuild the life that had been overshadowed by betrayal. My mornings were spent walking through the garden, savoring the crisp air, feeling the earth beneath my boots. Afternoons were spent with letters, planning charitable contributions, and reconnecting with old friends who had stood silently by while the storm raged. Evenings were quiet, reflective, the soft light of lamps casting shadows that seemed to bow in respect for the trials overcome. One afternoon, Margaret stopped by, bringing a basket of fresh bread and a warmth in her smile that reminded me of old, enduring friendships. "You look lighter, Julia," she said, her eyes scanning the room as if to take in the peace surrounding me. "The weight of their betrayal seems to have lifted." I nodded, sipping my tea slowly. "It has," I admitted. "The fight is not over entirely, but I can finally feel that I've reclaimed what was always mine, and that feels like breathing for the first time in years." The satisfaction was tempered by a quiet vigilance. Daniel and Lydia were humbled, yes, but they still existed, still needed to learn their place. I made plans to ensure that the lessons they had ignored would not fade with time. There would be no more opportunities for manipulation, no more moments where my kindness could be mistaken for weakness. Every step they took now would be observed, every choice weighed against the truth they could no longer escape. That night, as the wind rattled the window softly and snow began to dust the world outside, I sat by the fireplace and allowed myself to reflect. The humiliation, the abandonment, the deception, all of it had been endured, recorded, and transformed into something that could not be undone. For the first time in months, I felt the calm assurance of someone who had not only survived, but had emerged victorious, unbroken, and fully in control of her life once more. Justice had been served, the balance restored, and in the quiet that followed, I felt not only relief, but a deep, enduring satisfaction that the reckoning had been complete, precise, and inevitable. The morning light spilled gently across my living room, painting the walls in warm gold. And for the first time in months, the sunlight felt like a celebration rather than a reminder of betrayal. The court's decision had solidified, every property restored to my name, every debt rightfully reassigned to Daniel. Lydia's false sense of grandeur had vanished. She and Daniel were navigating a world where their actions carried real consequences. The weight that had pressed on me for so long, the humiliation, the neglect, the outright betrayal, had finally lifted, leaving space for something I had not allowed myself in years: relief. I walked through the halls of my home, touching the surfaces that once had been threatened with loss, and a quiet pride surged through me. Every room, every piece of furniture, every corner of the garden was mine, not because I had claimed it through anger, but because I had been patient, vigilant,
and unwavering. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and the faint scent of my late mother's lavender perfume, a reminder that the life I had nurtured and protected could not be stolen, no matter how audacious the attempt. Outside, the town felt lighter somehow, as though my triumph had created a ripple of justice that everyone could sense. Neighbors who had once looked at me with pity now offered nods of respect. Friends who had stood quietly by during the months of deception smiled knowingly as I walked past. Even Margaret, always steady, remarked with a twinkle in her eye, "You've done more than reclaim property, Julia. You've reclaimed your dignity." And dignity, I realized, was far more precious than any mansion, any bank account, or any collection of possessions. The revenge, meticulously planned and executed in the courtroom, had not been cruel, but it had been complete. Daniel and Lydia were now fully aware of the consequences of their arrogance and deceit. They worked for a living, no longer flaunting wealth or manipulating others, forced to confront the reality they had long ignored. They could not take from me what I had earned, safeguarded, and protected. Sitting in the garden that afternoon, the wind brushing softly against my face and the trees swaying gently, I allowed myself a rare smile. The snow that had begun falling earlier now dusted the flower beds, creating a peaceful scene that contrasted starkly with the turmoil of recent months. I thought of the hospital visits I had endured alone, the laughter I had overheard at my expense, the moments when even my son had dismissed me as old and irrelevant. All of that had been endured, and now it had been transformed into power. I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the world outside, feeling a sense of calm that had eluded me for decades. I could plan, act, and move freely now, knowing that no one could undermine my life, no one could question my authority over what was mine. Daniel and Lydia were shadows of their former selves, learning humility and responsibility the hard way, while I walked forward, independent, respected, and fully in command of my own story. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky with pinks and purples, I reflected on the journey. It had been long, painful, and marked by betrayal, but it had also revealed a truth I had known deep down. Patience, vigilance, and an unwavering sense of justice could overcome even the most audacious of deceits. I had endured, I had planned, I had waited, and in the end, victory had been mine. Sitting by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames wrapping around me like a protective cloak, I allowed myself one final quiet thought. The betrayal of family had been bitter, but the triumph that followed was sweeter than I could have imagined. I had not only reclaimed my property and my finances, I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and the certainty that no one could ever take from me what I had earned, safeguarded, and protected. The world outside was silent, the snow falling softly over the town, and I felt an unshakable peace settle within me. Justice had been served, revenge had been precise, and finally, at last, Julia, me, was free.